We began this series of videos with consideration of the comments of Professor Israel Finkelstein.
The attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties. There is no mention of such an event in any New Kingdom source. There is no trace of the early Hebrews in Egypt. The northern coast of Sinai was protected by formidable Egyptian forts, which could have easily prevented an escaping people from crossing the desert. There is no trace of late bronze remains in the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, not even in a place like Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are supposed to have camped for a long time. And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters. Finally, many of the places mentioned in the story of Exodus and the wandering in the desert were not inhabited before the 8th or even 7th centuries BC.
Since then, we have examined the assumptions that led Finkelstein and other scholars to look for evidence of the Exodus in the 13th century BC, during the reign of Ramses II. We have weighed these assumptions against the testimony of the Bible and the historical record, and come to the conclusion that the Exodus should be understood as having occurred in or around 1450 to 1400 BC, during Egypt's 18th dynasty. We've even gone so far as to propose candidates for the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites, the pharaoh of the Exodus itself, and the expected fallout in Egypt. Our response would be incomplete if we didn't offer an alternative to the statement of Professor Finkelstein. First, let me say that I wholeheartedly agree with what he has said. The Exodus did not take place in the 13th century BC. However, instead of simply saying that this recognition means that the Exodus didn't take place at all, the question should be, when did the Exodus and the events of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt take place? I will be building upon the arguments I have laid out over the course of the previous videos. If there is a position I present that you would like more information on, then I will refer you back to my prior work. Our starting place will be the Exodus itself. My proposal is that the Exodus was the event that ended the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, resulting in the subsequent decline and collapse of the 18th dynasty, as evidenced by Egyptian apathy towards their Levantine vassals and allies from the reigns of Amenhotep III through I. This means the approximate date for the Exodus is 1400 BC by contemporary chronology. Scripturally, this favors the Septuagint's reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 as the proper date, that the Exodus occurred 440 years before the 4th year of Solomon, rather than 480 years as found in the Masoretic text. Following the Exodus, the Israelites wandered in the desert of the Arabian Peninsula for 38 years, roughly 1362 BC, before the first generation of people had passed away. This parallels the approximately 38-year reign of Amenhotep III, the time where Egyptian hegemony over Canaan and Syria was waning. Joshua's conquest would have begun in the 2nd year of the reign of Akhenaten, roughly 1360 BC, whose reign is contemporary with the attacks of the, quote, Habiru, against former Egyptian vassals in the Levant, as documented in the Amarna letters. I propose, therefore, that the Israelites were one of the many groups designated as Habiru by the nations of the ancient Near East. Perhaps it is from this designation that the term Hebrew would later arise, the Israelites being the most well-established group of the former Habiru. It would also be around 1360 BC that Jericho falls in this timeline. Going backwards, we will use the short sojourn timeline as described in the Septuagint reading of Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 and affirmed by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 3 verse 17. that the 430 years encompasses the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12 through the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Thus, quote, "Your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs," is the time of the patriarchs in Canaan, which precedes the time where, quote, "they will be enslaved and oppressed" in Egypt. Assuming both of these periods to be relatively equal, we're looking for approximately 215 years for each. With the Exodus and Sinai taking place in around 1400 BC, this places Abraham's departure from Haran in approximately 1830 BC. This means that the pharaoh that Abraham encountered was one of the 12th dynasty pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, perhaps Sesostris III or Amenhotep III. God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 takes place 400 years prior to the Exodus, approximately 1800 BC. The fourth generation prophesied in verse 16 is the fourth generation of oppressed Israelites in Egypt, rather than the fourth generation after Abraham. Assuming a generation to be 20 to 40 years of age, we have a start of the oppression period between 80 to 160 years before the Exodus. Placing the Exodus at about 1400 BC at the close of the reign of Thutmose IV reveals a prime candidate for the pharaoh of the oppression in Ahmose I, the man who expelled the Semitic Hyksos rulers from Avaris and established the 18th dynasty. It was he who would institute a policy of Canaanite slave raiding, likely also enslaving any remaining Semitic people living in the Delta region of Egypt, and would convert Avaris into a store city. If these events are those recorded in Exodus chapter 1, then the oppression of the Israelites begins with the start of the 18th dynasty, around 1550 BC, and lasts for 150 or so years. This leaves us with locating Joseph's time in Egypt and Israel's migration into Goshen. Assuming, again, that the 430 years in Egypt and Canaan should be understood as evenly split, then we're looking for the migration to take place around 215 years before the Exodus. This points us to about 1615 BC, right in the middle of Egypt's 15th dynasty, the last of the Hyksos rulers in Avaris. Joseph, therefore, enters Egypt as a slave around 1630 BC and rises to prominence in the court of one of the Hyksos kings. According to this timeline, our final dates are as follows. Abraham leaves Haran in approximately 1830 BC. He enters Egypt during the 12th dynasty. He covenants with God in approximately 1800 BC. Joseph is sold into slavery prior to 1630 BC. He is brought into the court of a Hyksos pharaoh in roughly 1615 BC. Ahmose I, in other words, the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, enslaves the Israelites at the beginning of the 18th dynasty in 1550 BC. Moses is born approximately 1480 BC, possibly during the reign of Thutmose II or Hatshepsut. This would have him being raised alongside Thutmose III, while his flight from Egypt to Midian at 40 years old would have occurred in the middle of Thutmose III's reign, roughly 1440 BC. Thutmose III then would be the pharaoh who died while Moses was in exile. If this timeline is correct, then the reign of Amenhotep II would have come and gone during Moses' exile without the Bible's mention. Moses returns to Egypt with Aaron at age 80 in about 1400 BC to stand before Thutmose IV and lead the Israelites out of slavery. The Israelites then wander in the Arabian desert for 38 years through roughly 1362 BC, during the reign of Amenhotep III, until the first generation of Israelites have died. Moses dies in about 1360 BC, in the second year of Akhenaten, and Joshua begins the conquest of Canaan, starting with Jericho at this time. Admittedly, this timeline is not without points of contention or questions of interpretation. For example, There are only about 65 years between the ascensions of Joseph and Ahmose I. If Joseph was 30 at his ascension and 110 at his death, then there should be at least 80 years between his ascension and the ascension of Ahmose I. The language of Exodus intimates that there may have been a length of time in between Joseph's death and the pharaoh of the oppression as well. Some scholars, however, suggest that Joseph's 110 years of age is an idealized figure rather than a literal one, based upon evidence of the Egyptians commemorating important dignitaries with an age of 110 years. If Joseph was remembered domestically as a national hero for his efforts in the famine, perhaps this age was attributed to him out of reverence, according to the Egyptian tradition. Also, there are customs ascribed to Joseph that appear to coincide better with a pharaoh of native Egyptian heritage rather than one of the Hyksos. Genesis chapter 41 verse 14 records that Joseph shaved before appearing to Pharaoh. Native Egyptians were clean-shaven for hygienic reasons. In contrast, Canaanites, Semites, and other Asiatics are traditionally depicted in Egyptian art with facial hair. Verse 45 of this chapter describes Pharaoh giving Joseph an Egyptian name. Genesis chapter 43 verse 42 records that Joseph did not eat with his brothers because, quote, the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is loathsome to the Egyptians. At face value, these things may be indications that Joseph came to power under a native Egyptian pharaoh. The implication being that Joseph's time in Egypt would need to predate the Second Intermediate Period, when Egypt maintained native rule in the Delta region. Arguing against this position, though, is the mention of Pharaoh's chariot in Genesis 41, verse 43. It is widely agreed that the Egyptians were introduced to the chariot by the Hyksos rulers, not having had them previously. Thus, if Joseph were a product of the Middle Kingdom, the mention of Pharaoh's chariot would be an anachronism. We'll discuss the dating of Joseph specifically in a future video. There are other issues that are worth discussing that we don't have time to cover in this video. For any outstanding questions of interpretation or contentions that may be present in this timeline, my aim was to offer a proposed ballpark for interested parties to consider as an alternative to the standard interpretations espoused among skeptical scholarship for a 13th century BC Exodus. If you have enjoyed this series of videos, or if you have found the information we've discussed valuable, please leave a thumbs up and click the subscribe button to stay up to date on my newest content. For further reading on this subject, I have included a list of books in the description box below.